Hello, everyone. Very warm welcome to Sotheby's. And for today's discussion, sitting and hanging, working with great British artists as part of Sotheby's Jubilee program for the season. Her Majesty The Queen's Platinum Jubilee obviously represents a singular cultural moment. And as I think you can see, our galleries have been taken over specifically with curated exhibitions of royal portraits, historic books, manuscripts, rare aristocratic jewels, and indeed highlights from our upcoming Jubilee sales season, as we celebrate the visual, performing, literary arts and offer a platform for the next generation. Now, in honor of this occasion, Sotheby's Jubilee season showcases the breadth and diversity and excellence of British creativity. And I'm delighted to welcome today Caroline and Martin here. Caroline Campbell is the Director of Collections and Research at the National Gallery here in London, and has held curatorial positions at the Courtauld, National Gallery and the Ashmolean in Oxford, and published widely in the fields of Renaissance art, and curated and co-curated many exhibitions. I think most recently the Leonardo Experience, a Masterpiece, 2019 and 2020. And Martin Gayford is the art critic for The Spectator and author of biographical studies of Michelangelo, John Constable, Vincent van Gogh. He's also been curator of a number of exhibitions, most recently Hockney's Eye at the Fitzwilliam Museum in Cambridge, and forthcoming Lucian Freud, the painter, and his family at the Freud Museum in London, which opens in July of this year. He's also, of course, sat for portraits by both Hockney and Freud, the latter experience being the subject of his book, Man in a Blue Scarf, which I'm sure we will touch on later. And his most recent book, Spring Cannot Be Cancelled, co-written with David Hockney, and a forthcoming book, which is very exciting, called Love, Lucian. It's a collection of Lucian's early correspondence and edited with David Dawson. So very exciting indeed. Now, as we touch on British creativity and what we see here, what Sotheby's is doing, I think it echoes what many institutions are doing around the country, and I think what we saw last weekend with the official Jubilee celebrations, what a wonderful, creative country we are. And Caroline, I know the National Gallery are doing certain programs in line with this as well.
We are. We're doing a program. We did a program of events last week, but we're also doing an online and physical exhibition, which will run until the end of the year. So it's a trail through our galleries of paintings associated with queens and tributes associated with being a ruler, particularly a female one, I think. So looking at wisdom, looking at mercy, looking also at the idea of service, which is something that I think really resonates with all of us, and which our queen mentioned before she became queen, and again then in February 2022. So we're excited to have events that don't just last in the Jubilee, but continue, because Her Majesty has been such a supporter of the gallery, either opening the Sainsbury Ring in 1991, but also with loans, great loans from the Royal Collection, which populate our permanent galleries. And the online exhibition is a lot of fun. I hope you have a chance to look at it. I think it's on the screen at the moment, shots of it. So it's a combination of an online show, which you visit this virtual gallery, seeing conjunctions of pictures you would never normally see together in real life. And also you can mark that through the collection. But I think it feels, you know, as somebody who comes from one of the four nations, it's been wonderful over the last week as I've been to Jubilee celebrations in Yorkshire, not sadly in Northern Ireland and in London, the variety of ways in which people have really wanted to celebrate this moment. And that's something we were keen to do at the gallery, that it would not just, it would be something that was traditional, but also embraced new technology as well too. Exactly,
and I think what we've done here very much echoes that sensibility. If you look at our exhibition downstairs, Power and Image, we've managed to get portraits of every regnant Queen of England, from, you know, Mary I, Elizabeth I, the great Woburn, the great Armada portrait from Woburn Abbey of Elizabeth I, you know, the crashing boats of the Spanish Armada. My Spanish colleagues are not so favourable of it, but but right until the late portrait of Queen Elizabeth II by Andy Warhol. Now, there's obviously one portrait of the Queen that we don't have, and that is Lucian Freud's one. And as we celebrate 70 years on the throne for the Queen, we're also marking this year the centenary of Lucian Freud's birth. And there are several instances in which Freud and the Queen have sort of overlapped. And I think one of the early ones was when he received the Order of Merit, which is the most personal award given by Her Majesty, and it's awarded to 24 recipients of arts and literature. And there's a very nice quote, which I'll read, which I think really sums up Britain as a nation, and I think the Queen, you know, in terms of legacy and how monarchy has evolved and how the country has evolved, and the reason why Freud accepted it. And then he says, effectively, Britain has taken me in. The reason I accepted it is because I'm a naturalized British subject, and if my country of adoption gives me an honor, I can't refuse it, which I think is rather nice. And obviously, you know, emigrating from Germany with his grandfather in the early 30s, you know, he's not British born, but very much British made, I think. Now, fast forward to the end of the decade, we see Freud painting Her Majesty herself in 2001. Now, this is quite an extraordinary portrait, really. And just about the time when, probably just before that you were sitting.
Yes, a couple of years, yes.
Yeah, a couple of years.
Yes, I went and saw that in his studio. I wrote a piece for a newspaper about it, and he showed it to me as a little thing of it. It had come back to his studio in Kensington. I think the sittings with the Queen were in St James's Palace, but actually one of the things about it is that he had somebody else sit with the tiara on her head, which is sort of cheaty by his rules. He would usually wouldn't have anybody except the sitter sit for any part of the picture, and he wouldn't paint any part of the picture without the sitter present. But he slightly waived the rules.
I think that's fair enough.
Yes. I think if you're painting the Queen.
Yes. What I don't know is, what I'd be interested to know is when they first met, because I think Lucian went to a lot of parties thrown by Esmond Rothermere, and Anne, he was then married to Anne Fleming, he was later married to Ian Fleming in 1949, 50, 51. And Princess Margaret was certainly present there, and Lucian described them as semi-royal occasions. I imagine they'd probably known each other since then. So,
and I think probably the same sort of. I know Lucian was obviously friends with the Devonshires as well, and there's a mutual love of horse racing, I think.
Yes.
And I think Lucian talked about, you know, Lucian was a great talker during his sittings, I believe, and I think they had a mutual love for the races.
Yes. Actually, Lucian was very good at tailoring his conversation during settings to the interests of the person who was sitting. I think he's like, the back of his mind was always the idea that this person may get fed up and just say, sorry, I can't stand it.
With a very long sitting.
Yeah. So he set out to be entertaining. So I think, I understand, for example, the Duke of Devonshire also got a lot of horsey conversation. I got, you know, anecdotes about meeting Picasso, and for his child sitters, he'd do little dances, and he sang songs to me, actually. Also, I don't know the only thing he told me about was a discussion of a pheasant shoot, which he'd had with the Queen, actually.
Oh, really? Amazing, amazing. And I think, as you said earlier, like, it's quite a unique portrait because they're mostly all in his studio, certainly at this part of his life. So he had to go out and...
Well, this was intended to be in his studio. Lucian and the Queen had cooked up a plan whereby she would come in an unmarked van to Kensington Church Street and presumably sort of nip out of the back where in disguise and into his studio. And unfortunately, they were discussing it in one of those lines which people sort of line up and shake hands and stuff. And a newspaper editor was next in line and overheard, and a story appeared in the press, and so that was, for security reasons, that couldn't be done.
And obviously, as I mentioned, we don't have this portrait here, unfortunately, but I do believe that the National Gallery, whose forthcoming retrospective, which opens up in October, will be exhibiting the painting. Is that correct?
We will be exhibiting the painting thanks to the generosity of the Queen and of the Royal Collection. And it is going to be remarkable to see it in that context. The exhibition at the National Gallery is happening at the National Gallery because that was where he really wanted the exhibition to happen, because of his long relationship with the institution, and more importantly, as Martin knows better than me, with the pictures. But it will be really wonderful to see the painting there, because it's such a small painting, and although many of his paintings are in quite a small scale, this is a really unusually small one, isn't it, Martin?
Yes, I think that was probably to do with the fact he knew he was going to have a limited number of sittings. I understand he got more royal sittings than most artists who paint the Queen get, but it's still, by Lucian standards, it was a very, very quickly done.
I think that there's a quote which I'll sort of paraphrase. I think he said to her, I know you think I'm going slowly, but for me, I'm going at the speed of a rocket, or something like that. So that's going to be in the exhibition, which is incredibly exciting for everyone to see.
Yes.
Can you give us an idea of, I mean, is the exhibition going to be themed, or is it a sort of chronological look throughout his life?
The exhibition is really building on all the work that Martin and other people have done over many, many years, so that we really understand the biography and the relationship, the chronology of Freud's life and his art. But it's going to take a chronological structure. You will start with the early work and you will end with the late work, but between that, the exhibition is going to look at themes, and the portrait of the Queen is, not surprisingly, you will understand, going to be in a room about power and about representations of powerful individuals, though of course the power that the Queen has is so different to that of the other people in that space. He will be industrialists, he will be bankers, all actually men as well too, and that's an interesting relationship as well. There will be a section of the exhibition which looks at intimacy. There will be a section that looks at works in the studio. There will be a little bit looking at Freud's relationship with the painters and artists who had gone before him. But I think it's very exciting for us at the National Gallery to present this really great figurative artist in the conjunction of a collection which he used and loved throughout his life. And I hope that people will go out from the spaces into the galleries and make those relationships and those connections with the pictures that he loved.
Yes, and he didn't actually just go in there to look at paintings. He worked in the National Gallery quite a lot in the late 90s, because he did a series of works from a painting by Chardin, the young schoolmistress. And he actually set up his easel in the gallery after the public had been shooed out, and worked there most evenings, I think, because it's not just one work. He did a large etching and a small etching and a painting and so on.
You said it's the most beautifully painted ear in the world, I think.
Yes, he was very keen on the ear. There's one image just of the ear.
Which is quite niche, I think, in art history, just to focus
Very
on
niche, but so special. I mean, that relationship which an artist has with a collection is so different to that of an art historian or a critic. And when I was a very young curator, I remember coming across this man whose face looked terribly familiar in the corridor at night. And I realized subsequently that it was Lucian Freud. And I was like, my goodness. And then I discovered that he was one of the very few people who was allowed to come. I mean, it's a very great privilege to be allowed in the National Gallery after hours, but he, from what I understand, used that privilege incredibly wisely and was continually in the gallery.
Yes, although he felt you need to be careful about consulting the old masters. He had this line that you ought to go there as you go to go to the doctor, i.e. to solve a specific problem. So
I love that idea.
If he couldn't get Liebauer's leg going quite right, he'd go off and look at Rembrandt and look at Velasquez and see how they dealt with it. But he thought you had to be careful to not be overawed by the achievements of the past, so that you had the confidence to carry on.
Yeah, that is a difficult one, isn't it? I mean, it is hard not to be overawed, I mean, as a visitor in these collections, but as somebody who was working in the same media, in the same tradition, very, very difficult. But I think he succeeds extremely well, and I think the exhibition will really demonstrate that.
I think I totally agree on that point. And what you said earlier, and I just want to come back to sort of the idea of power. And you said, you know, the Queen is one of, in this section, one of the only females in the room. But interestingly, very few of Lucian's portraits are named sitters. I think it's only artists and a few of the family. So you don't get a sense of who the person is when you're looking at a lot of his portraits. If you look at someone like the portrait of Debo Devonshire, it's woman in a white shirt, or Martin, it's man in a blue scarf. It's this sort of anonymous identity, but because he wants to reveal the real essence of that sitter. And so we don't have any preconceived notions of who those sitters might be it, as you say, an industrialist or a duke or whatever. It's just about the person.
Yes, yes. In principle, he thought it was best not to know anything about the sitter, and actually also the artist as well. We had a little argument about it, which he said that he thought it didn't matter if the picture was a forgery or not. For example, it was just a question of how good it was, and if it was a very good picture, then fine. It didn't really matter if it was by Sickert.
I suppose it's really interesting because, of course, there are all sorts of paintings through history that, you know, at one point are thought to be one artist, and other part they're not thought to be anybody, but they're still valued and they're still looked at. So I can see why.
Well, I think that was probably the point. One of the things we're going to exhibit at the Freud Museum is a painting that Lucian did of a favourite book, which was also a favourite book of his grandfather's, by the way, which is a book of Egyptian history, and he particularly liked plates 120 and 121, which are of two anonymous faces which were excavated in Middle Egypt, and nobody knows who they were. And he looked at this again and again and again. And I think one of the lessons he learned from that is that you can get an enormous amount of emotion and feeling and understanding from just looking at something without really having any information about the people in it at all.
So if you think about, did he choose all the titles for his works, or was he not very interested in that?
Oh, yes, he did choose the titles. He was quite specific, but and you liked putting the postal address of where, you know, interior W11, that kind of thing.
And some of them are quite quirky as well. So there's a little bit of play in some of his titles. But it's interesting, you know, as an artist, he wanted to sort of be, you know, the artist is not important, the sitter is not important. But us as the outsider, Freud is incredibly interesting, and his sitters are so varied and so wide across all, you know, manners of society that the narrative is so engaging. That's why I think, you know, everyone loves his art so much, and why there's so many exhibitions and books and continuing, as we were talking earlier, there's so much more information that is coming out.
Yes, so that's I think one of the fascinating things about Lucian is that I think because he was quite secretive and his life was very compartmentalised, and on the other hand, he lived at tremendous, when he's not in the studio, at a tremendous velocity. There seems to be an unlimited amount of new information, and even new works keep appearing. I think, going back to the Queen for a moment, I remember he said that he was interested in this unique position she held, and he was interested in how he'd always seen her face on stamps, and I should think probably banknotes as well. So that was part of that picture.
And wanting to do something that was different to that, or which recalled that iconic quality, because it always seems to me like it is a very iconic image.
Yes, although it's not much like the Queen on the stamp.
No.
Well, yes, I think he probably wanted to build that in while getting a completely truthful image of this woman he probably knew quite well.
Yeah, and probably quite a difficult task for him, because normally everything was sort of on his own terms about who he picked to sit, and whilst that was obviously a conversation, as you say, it's someone so well known, and there's, I guess, everyone has an idea of how a monarch should be portrayed, and because there's so many so many images of us, and certainly our Queen today. You know, she's probably the most recognised figure in the world. So it was probably quite a daunting task for him. Or did he sort of take it in his stride?
Well, he didn't mention that he was daunted, but
No.
It was quite a bold thing to do. And I wonder, I mean, we'll see in the future how well it lasts. It seems to me a very strong image in comparison with most of the depictions that have been made of her. Yeah. So I feel it will last.
And just going on, and we were talking about Freud's love of the National Gallery and painting there, and the sort of going back and sort of just looking at the old masters, rather than sort of overdosing on the medicine, going to the doctor, just sort of like looking and taking bits. But there was particular artists and particular paintings that he loved as well. And I think it's the Titians. There's a great photograph here of him. I think it's Diana and Actaeon, which I think he's talked about in depth before as well.
Yes, and Diana and Callisto was it. Well, he felt they were jointly his favourite picture. He felt he couldn't really separate them.
Well, I agree. You can't separate them. I mean, there's water running from one that goes into the other. Titian designed them as a pair, and at the moment, my colleague Matthias has hung them separately, which it looks amazing. It's between the death of Actaeon, so you've got, but it's strange because they are such connected works.
Yes, and Lucian knew them very well because he'd gone to see them in the National Gallery of Scotland, where they were on loan for many years, frequently when he was staying in Scotland. And he told me that actually he would have liked to have one or both in his sitting room, which had he acted on it might have been rather difficult for the National Gallery, because he probably could have at that stage afforded it.
Yeah, exactly.
He probably could indeed, but they are extraordinary pictures. I mean, one of my first experiences of looking at art as a teenager was walking in off the Mall in Edinburgh and being totally blown away by Diana and Actaeon. I mean, it's a picture that responds to every situation, but what did he particularly like about it?
Well, he said all sorts of things. He said he liked the fact that the more you look, the more dogs you find in the. He said one of the nymphs, who's I think the one sitting on the fountain, he felt he could identify by her toes if he'd come across her. Titian was his favourite painter by some way, actually, so much so that he made Titian an honorary French artist, because Lucian's official view was that he preferred French painting, but he made exceptions. For example, he didn't like Poussin, so he made him an Italian
Well,
artist.
other people might do that too.
Yes.
Wouldn't be alone
there are
there.
justifications.
Yeah, there are justifications.
But Titian he promoted into the French school. I think he felt the obvious things, the treatment of flesh and the sense of mortality. He said one thing which was stuck in my mind, is that he thought every really great painting ought to have a little piece of poison in it. And so I said, well, what's the little piece of poison?
Yeah.
He said, well, for example, mortality might be a little piece of poison. I think that's probably what he...
It's almost more than a little piece of poison in that picture, because Actaeon looks and he sees the skull, which is what he's going to become.
Yes, well, yes, it's really the plot, yes.
Yeah. No, that's interesting, that idea that every picture has to have a little bit of poison in it. How did he, I mean, what did he see that in relation to his
every
art?
really good picture, I think. I suppose he meant, you can be blandly pretty and even blandly beautiful, and that would be fine up to a certain point, but you've got to have maybe an element of tragedy or some dark.
Needs an edge to just a bit of intensity. And I think that's true of a lot of Lucian's paintings himself. There's always a little bit of, unnervingness on the great paintings. But interesting, going to you talking about French paintings, because just looking at this image here of the Corot, him looking with Nicholas Penny at his house in Kenchurch Street, which I believe is now...
This was so extraordinary. So this picture, you probably all know the story. I think Lucian Freud brought in about 2001, something like that. And when he died, it came to the National Gallery through the Acceptance in Use scheme, this incredible scheme which brings great works of art into our national collections. And specifically, he wanted it to come to the National Gallery in thanks for the way in which his family and he had been given a place being made British.
Yeah.
This was somewhere where they felt very much at home, and it's a really interesting picture, this, because it's quite an unusual Corot. I mean, Corot does paint portraits, but I suppose I think of him more as a landscape painter. Yes. And this is a very painterly picture.
Yes, and rather Freudian, actually.
What would you say would be Freudian about it? In the way in which the paint's applied, or?
The sort of sense of presence,
yeah.
the weight of it. We had a little conversation about that, and I suggested that because a sitter for Van Gogh about 20 years, 15 years after that was painted, was identified as an old model of Corot's, and I said to Lucian, well, perhaps it's the same woman, and Lucian said, well, actually, I showed him the Van Gogh, and he said, yes, I have a feeling I've seen this woman before, so I mean, that's not really evidence, and it's probably unprovable.
Interesting, because this woman is said to be an Italian, but I don't think we know who she is exactly. Yes, yes. She's wearing sort of Italianate peasant costume.
Yes, the Van Gogh, a friend of Van Gogh was called Segatori, so she was Italian, yeah.
Interesting connection. I mean, it's a wonderful picture of the Corot in its dark tonalities and then these sudden sort of splashes of colour.
Looked fabulous over Lucian's
mantelpiece, as you can see it in that in that photograph.
Yes, there. And the whole room was marvellous for pictures because Lucian had. Is a rather good example of his interior decoration by inactivity. He'd got this perfect 18th century, sort of 1750 circa house, and he was having it redecorated, and the workmen had taken off all the layers of wallpaper down to the 18th century plaster, and Lucian just said, stop, that looks very good. So he had this crumbling 18th century plaster with that and Frank Auerbach.
Exactly. There's a great book that David Dawson, his assistant, has published a few years ago of all the images of Lucian, which he was able to take. And there's lots of shots of the interiors, and as Martin says, you have this sort of rendered back plaster wall, very sort of bohemian, and then you have, you know, amazing Frank Auerbach's, Degas sculptures, Rodin, the Corot. It's this wonderful juxtaposition, but it's really about the essence of the pictures. There's no sort of fluff or anything, which is what he was, I guess, doing as a painter himself.
Yes, he liked everything au naturel.
Yeah.
Nothing. He was like that with food as well. He didn't want it.
Yeah, there's wonderful. If you read, he has wonderful breakfasts, sort of woodcock and on toast and stuff.
Yes.
Now, you obviously have sat for him. I mean, your experience of sitting for him, what was that like? Is the memory of it as vivid now as it was?
It's quite vivid. It's getting on for 20 years ago now, but yes, I do remember it. Well, lots of things. It was very, very interesting. It was interminable. One wondered when it was going to end. It was full of fascinating incidents, and I personally found it very interesting to watch him work, and I think different people would have got different things from sitting from him. I was talking to another of his sitters just the other day, and she was saying that she'd learned something from sitting, which is that you can get through problems. That Lucian would just work on and resolve things. Well, actually, quite often he put his boot through the paintings he didn't like, but the lessons she'd drawn was that if you just carry on, you may be able to solve a problem.
It was sort of therapy by proxy.
Yes, there certainly was a therapeutic feeling about it, I found.
I mean, did you find, as a sort of art critic and writer and someone who's constantly looking at pictures and portraits, were you able to sort of sit back, or were you, as you say, were you just interested in the methods of the man and how he was painting? I mean, I was sort of a different take on it being.
Well, all of those, yes. I was interested in how it happened, and I was. I couldn't look at the canvas while I was actually being painted, but
not at all. He wouldn't let you.
No, every time we had a break, I'd get up to see if there was any discernible change. And sometimes a blob would appear.
And how many hours? Because it's notorious for being incredibly slow.
Yes, it was slowish. Around 150 for the for the painting, and probably about the same for the etching.
Okay, which is
That's
quite
a lot.
I mean, it's quite a commitment for a sitter.
Yes.
I know he's very strict, wasn't he, in terms of...
Well, that was one thing about Lucian. He was, in a way, fast and loose about lots of things, but he was a real tyrant about timetables. If people were 5 minutes late, he said it damaged his morale. He began to get agitated. So he really wanted everyone to arrive on the dot.
You were a good student.
Well, I'm like that too. I hate being late.
Did you have a certain time that you came every week, or I should remember?
Well, we'd arrange it in advance. It was, yes, I usually arrived at 6 because that was an evening painting, and then we'd have a chat and a drink. Well, I'd probably have a drink. He didn't drink before working. He might have a cup of tea, and then he was sort of revving himself up, getting in the right mental space to start, and then we'd go upstairs and begin.
I mean, it's just a fascinating process, I think. I've not sat for a portrait myself, but I just imagine, what do you, I mean, looking back on it now and looking at, at the time, looking at the portrait of yourself, do you see yourself in it?
Yes, and him.
Yeah.
That's an interesting idea.
I mean, I have an interesting question about portraits is do you find out more about the sitter or more about the painter? Yeah. And I'm not sure of the answer to that. Maybe Caroline.
Maybe that's why we find portraits so fascinating, Martin, actually. Because
you're seeing
both at the same time and trying to work out what do you see of him in your portrait?
I think the intensity. Also, of course, it's his selection of what he was interested in me. And yes, it's a sort of cutting down to the essential and sort of fundamental force. I always, when I looked at it, I always thought it looked a lot more forceful than I felt when I was sitting.
But I guess that's the sort of vulnerability of being beholden to someone else for a long period of time. And actually, as you're saying, the portrait is about as much the artist and their view on...
Yes, well, it's a work of art. It's not a transcription of you in any sort of mechanical way.
And I mean, the title "Man with the Blue Scarf" is sort of now iconized because of your book chronicling it. Was that a specific motif, or did it happen by chance? Because I imagine you probably had to wear it every sitting.
Yeah, oh yes, and once wore the slightly wrong shade of blue because I got 2, and Lucian was completely thrown, which was very interesting.
Oh, really?
He could not paint. He was going to paint the blue scarf that evening, and this other scarf is pretty close actually, which is why I made the mistake. But he kept mixing a colour and almost putting a brush, and then he said, "Oh, I've obviously gone mad. I just can't do this," and he did something else instead. Interesting.
Because it affects.
Because he was building a sort of chromatic structure, and that which was exactly key to that scarf, which was rather bright, I think, for him.
And it's interesting because by the nature of portraits and flesh, you think it's sort of variation on a couple of tones, but actually when you look at one of Lucian's portraits, they're incredibly rich in a variety of colours, and we saw a painting here last year of the artist David Hockney, and looking at that, and again it was a very intense, square-on portrait, but looking at it, you'd have like quite sort of vibrant yellows within the flesh and blues, and up close it's a very abstract thing, but by far, when you stood from far, it works completely, it all molds together.
And that was much stronger because he started in the middle of my forehead and moved outwards. And so to begin with, there just seemed to be a patch of khaki, a patch of lime green, a patch of grey. It was quite surprising. But it all, actually, when the blue scarf went in, the whole thing seemed to go into harmony. So I imagine...
Was that the sort of, the final...
That was quite late in the process,
And I should know this, but did he draw on his canvases at all, or was it all just immediately?
Yeah, the first session was a drawing in charcoal, and he roughly worked from that. Although it was a bit bigger actually than what he finally did. An interesting thing is his daughter Rose has discovered a letter from his father Ernst, written, not quite clear when, maybe in the 40s, early 50s, saying, "You're really completely wrong in the way you set about pain." I mean, I hope you don't mind me saying this, but this starting in the middle and working out, it's just completely all the wrong way around.
Really?
Which apparently is very typical of his father, who felt he knew best about...
But did his father ever paint?
Yes, he did paint. Yeah. He not only painted, but Lucian's daughter, Annie, who knew him very well, told me that Ernst would always criticise and correct her paintings when she did. So he probably did the same to Lucian.
That's a nice segue talking about letters, because your forthcoming book, Love, Lucian, which I've managed to have a sneak peek of, and it's so rich, and as I was saying earlier, there's always more to learn about Lucian. It's so rich in subject and the protagonist in whom he is writing to. It provides such a wonderful insight. And just coming on to Ernst, there's some great letters where he's written on his father's letterhead, but he's just crossed out Ernst and put L, isn't there?
Well, that's Freudian, if you like.
Yeah. Can you tell us a little bit how the book has sort of come about, and the sort of...
Well, it was really my co-author David Dawson's idea. David said to me, "I really think something should be done about these letters, because they show what an amazingly lively, energetic, interesting young man he was." And I thought, well, actually, he's right. So we set out on doing it, and it's been quite a long, winding road. There's a lot of detective work involved. We've discovered quite a lot of correspondence which was completely unknown, and it kept turning up until quite late in the publication process, which alarmed the people at Thames and Hudson, because they wanted everything.
They wanted the book to be
yes,
done.
not another letter. I know, you just mustn't find any more letters. And I imagine more will turn up when it's published, because that's always the way.
That's always the way.
So maybe in the next edition. And I think you do find out a lot about him. One thing, actually, which relates to what I was saying about him talking to his sitters, is that he addresses every person differently, and the handwriting is different for every person as well. The handwriting changes. You know, Kenneth Clark. There's a letter to Kenneth Clark, ex-director of the National Gallery, written for Lucian very, very carefully. Sort of not quite.
Copperplate?
Not quite. Well, he didn't quite do copperplate, but you know, you get an absolute drunken scrawl on other occasions. There's one letter to his friend John Craxton. There are a lot of newly discovered letters to Craxton, which are very, very, some of the best, actually. But this one, although it's very short, it's a favourite of mine. It's on the letterhead of a hotel in the west of Ireland, and he just writes, "Dear Splooch, I'll tell you all about it tomorrow. Too tired now. Whiskey."
So history does not relate to what happened that evening.
No, there are some drawings.
And I think what's so wonderful about these letters is because, I mean, Lucian was quite a private personality in truth, but the letters that are going to be in this book are in the sort of early period from the 30s to the 50s, and it's such a fascinating time. We at Sotheby's had sold some letters from the early period, which he had written to Felicity Hellaby, who he was a student with at Dedham Art School, and the whimsical nature of them is just really wonderful. So you get a real insight, as Martin says, of him as a person, but as a sort of sleuth, it's very interesting because he's talking about what he is often painting, and there was a great one, and it was talking about receiving a sort of a putrid bucket with a chicken's head on it.
Yes.
And then going and seeing that painting, you can see where that painting was done and what he was doing at the time. It sort of closes the circle in a really wonderful way.
Yes, Tom was very helpful to us, by the way, with putting all this together. And yes, the Felicity Hellaby letters are very good. We found out a bit more, actually, about those dead chickens. This is a footnote to art history. There's a sort of Lucian had a bit of a Cambridge period because he used to go and stay with the philosopher G. Moore, who's a friend of his parents, and he illustrated Nicholas Moore, who was a poet. He illustrated his first book of poetry. That's Lucian's first illustrated book. We also went to stay in Little Shelford with the family of an expert in diseases of poultry, who was a friend of a friend of John Craxton's, and John Craxton discovered these people, and this guy was sent all sorts of dead poultry for diagnosis during the war, and if you thought that it hadn't died of anything too contagious to human beings, they put it in the oven and ate it. Otherwise, there was a steady source of models for Freud and Craxton. Actually, Craxton too. There are a lot of dead poultry works.
Menagerie.
And at least one of Lucian's paintings was actually done in Little Shelford. You can see. I've talked to the daughter of their friend, and she's still got the table. It was
amazing.
It was painted.
But it's interesting, that period, because, as you say, he's doing a lot of studies of flora and fauna, and they're very intense paintings, and you can see every sort of bit of the feather on these birds. But it sort of translates. If you haven't seen Freud before and you saw those early paintings, and then you see his big voluptuous nudes, they're wildly different. But actually, the intensity and focus of looking at the subject carries throughout, and that's what he does when he's painting a person. That's that intensity of stare, and I guess why it takes so long, because he's looking at every little facet of the person.
Yes, trying to look at something as if nobody had ever looked at it before, including him. I think that was the aim.
Yeah, it's quite a powerful sort of thing to take on for an artist like. And I guess he's doing that every single day he comes back to the canvas. He's trying
it took a lot of concentration and bravery too, and I think it explains a certain amount of wildness when he was out of the studio, because he'd be spending 12 hours a day in the studio. Yes, concentrating very, very hard. And when he was young, he used to get terrible headaches because he was sitting down and focusing on something very close in front of him. And, some of the letters complain about that.
Yeah, and I think he talks about that period in the sort of, I think it's the mid-50s, where he just had enough of that, and that's where you get he changes his brush, and he gets more expressive and loose and thicker brush strokes, and he starts standing up throughout. I mean, there's a wonderful bit of a film that David did, and it was really towards the end of his life, and he's still painting in his late 80s, and he's springing about.
Yes. Yes, it was quite a balletic performance later on, because he didn't wear reading glasses to paint. He did to etch. He had to stand back several feet to see what the effect of what he'd done. So he'd go right close up to the canvas for each mark, and then spring back. That was it. And he felt, I remember him asking where he'd get hold of some bathroom scales, which seemed to be a sort of, I suggested John Lewis would be a good place to buy some. But he said he was worried that he'd put on a pound or two, and that it was very important that your weight was absolutely critically important if you did a physical job like
painting. Well, painting is a very physical job. People forget that.
Yes.
But yeah, been amazing to have the experience of sitting, because when you see a painting, it's there in the studio. We don't know how Titian painted, and we don't know how Rembrandt painted. We assume they moved around in the same way. But yeah, the combination of mental and physical exhaustion of making art is something you think of more for sculpture, I think, really, don't you?
Yes, it's a physical job, but painting is also a physical job.
Do you think, when you talk about physicality, if you look at the Titians, they're incredibly large paintings, and I think from the 80s, Lucian gravitated toward larger canvases, save the portrait of the Queen, but much bigger scaled monumental works. And there's been a few exhibitions, I think, Wallace Collection, Dulwich Picture Gallery, which has paired, and in Vienna as well, I think, which has paired his works alongside these great old masters, and it's the scale of these which is so impressive. And as a relatively small man, I guess the physicality of painting up high must have been something he was sort of echoing.
Yes, he used ladders for the...
It's a painted decorated
the Brigadier, for example, there's a photograph of him up the step ladder.
That's an incredibly tall painting.
That is a really tall painting. Or the paintings, the late studio, the paintings of the nudes in the studio. I mean, those are massive pictures.
Yeah. Well, I just want to say a huge thank you to both Caroline and Martin for joining us at Sotheby's today. I hope you will agree, what a fascinating discussion on one of Britain's great artists, certainly of the last 100 years, but in my mind, ever. And obviously a lot going forward to be excited about in sort of Freud sphere this year, with obviously exhibition at the Freud Museum that Martin is working on, and then the great exhibition which opens at the beginning of October at the National Gallery. So a lot to look forward to. We've obviously got lots on here at Sotheby's in terms of loan exhibitions downstairs and our summer highlights of our auctions. So I do encourage everyone to have a wander around. But thank you both once again.
Pleasure.
Pleasure.